The light of the Kremlin's towers cast long shadows across the Moscow River as the evening sun dipped below the horizon. In the depths of the presidential residence, Vladimir Putin sat alone in his office, reviewing a series of intelligence briefings that had arrived throughout the day. The reports were troubling. Unprecedented cyber attacks across Russia's critical infrastructure had been escalating for weeks. Power grids in 3 oblasts had temporarily failed, communications networks experienced mysterious outages, and several military installations reported ghost signatures on their radar systems. Putin's weathered face betrayed no emotion as he turned to the final page of the report. He had seen crises before: the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Chechen wars, economic sanctions, and attempted coups, but this was different. This was systematic, coordinated, and growing in intensity. Someone was testing Russia's defenses, probing for weaknesses, and preparing for something much larger. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Dmitry Peskov, his longtime press secretary, entered with a tablet in hand. "Mr. President, we've just received confirmation. The attack vectors match what our intelligence predicted. The Americans and their allies are behind this." Putin nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving the documents on his desk. "And our countermeasures?" "In place, but only partially effective," Peskov replied. "Our technical teams report that we're blocking approximately 60% of the intrusions, but the attacks are adapting, becoming more sophisticated. The Defense Ministry is concerned about our ability to maintain secure communications if this escalates further." Putin stood and walked to the window, gazing out at Moscow. The city continued its normal evening activities, citizens unaware of the digital war being waged around them. "Have the ministers assembled?" "Yes, sir. They're waiting in the secure conference room. Foreign intelligence reports that our response has them concerned. The Americans have moved their cyber command to heightened alert status." "Good," Putin said quietly. "They should be concerned." 30 minutes later, Putin walked briskly into the conference room where his most trusted advisors had gathered. Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, FSB Director Alexander Bortnikov, and several others stood as he entered. The room was specifically designed to prevent any electronic surveillance, a Faraday cage with additional countermeasures that made it one of the most secure locations in Russia. "Gentlemen," Putin began without preamble, "I've reviewed all the briefings. The situation is clear. Our adversaries believe they can destabilize our nation through technological means, thinking perhaps that a bloodless attack carries fewer consequences. They are mistaken." He turned to Shoigu. "What is the status of Project Blackout?" The defense minister cleared his throat. "Operational, Mr. President. We completed the final tests 3 weeks ago. The system can be activated with a notice of 30 minutes. Once initiated, we estimate complete deployment within 4 hours." Putin nodded. "And domestic preparations?" "Strategic reserves have been positioned across all major cities," replied Valentina Matvienko, the chairwoman of the Federation Council. "Essential services can be maintained for approximately 18 months under the emergency protocols. The regional governors have received their classified instructions but have not yet been authorized to implement them. The economic impact will be severe," cautioned Anton Siluanov, the finance minister. "Even with our preparations, disconnecting from the global financial system will create significant hardships. Our currency reserves can sustain us, but there will be inflation, shortages of certain goods, and potential civil unrest." Putin's expression remained stoic, "Which is why this decision is not made lightly. But our sovereignty is not negotiable. If we allow these attacks to continue without a decisive response, they will only intensify until our systems are compromised beyond repair." He turned to a large digital map on the wall, which displayed Russia and surrounding territories. With a gesture, the map zoomed out to reveal a global view with highlighted nodes representing internet exchange points, submarine communication cables, and satellite networks. For decades, the West has maintained control over global information flow. They built the infrastructure, they control the corporations that manage it, and they exploit this advantage to serve their geopolitical interests. After the Soviet Union fell, we accepted integration into their system on their terms. That was a mistake. The room was silent as Putin continued. Project Blackout is not merely a defensive measure. It is the culmination of 15 years of planning, our digital sovereignty strategy. When activated, Russia will temporarily disconnect from the global internet while simultaneously transitioning to our domestic RuNet infrastructure. But unlike previous tests, this will be permanent. Lavrov shifted in his seat. Mr. President, the diplomatic consequences will be manageable, Putin interjected, because this is not an isolated action. Our Chinese colleagues have been developing similar capabilities. Iran, North Korea, and several of our other partners have expressed interest in joining the alternative network once it's established. This will not be Russia alone against the world, but the beginning of a new world order in the digital domain. Outside the Kremlin walls, Moscow continued its evening routine. Restaurants filled with patrons, theaters performed their shows, and families gathered around televisions unaware that decisions being made would fundamentally alter their connection to the outside world. In the early hours of the morning, Putin returned to his office. He had given his ministers until dawn to prepare their respective departments for what would follow. Now, there was one final task before he would address the nation. He opened a secure communication channel to Beijing. After a brief pause, the face of Chinese President Xi Jinping appeared on the screen. The two leaders exchanged formal greetings before Putin spoke directly. The provocations have reached the threshold we discussed. We are initiating our response within the next 12 hours. Xi's expression remained neutral, but he nodded slightly. We understand. Our systems are prepared to align with the new protocols once your transition is complete. The separation will create short-term difficulties, but long-term independence. In the other preparations, Putin asked. Proceeding as agreed. The alternative financial messaging system is operational. Our banks have been instructed to begin transitioning critical transactions. The disruption will be minimized for our bilateral arrangements. After the call ended, Putin sat in silence for several minutes. What he was about to do had no precedent in the internet age. Russia would become the first major power to deliberately disconnect itself from the global network and establish a truly sovereign digital space. The implications were enormous, economic, social, political, but in Putin's mind, the alternative was worse: continued vulnerability to Western cyber offensives and the gradual erosion of Russian sovereignty. At 7 a.m. Moscow time, television and radio broadcasts across Russia were interrupted. The familiar face of Vladimir Putin appeared on screens nationwide. His expression was grave, his posture straight, his voice measured and deliberate. Citizens of Russia, I address you at a critical moment in our nation's history. For weeks, our country has been under sustained attack. Not with conventional weapons, but through digital means targeting our vital infrastructure, military systems, and economic institutions. These attacks originate from those who have long sought to undermine Russia's independence and sovereignty. The cameras captured his unwavering gaze as he continued. Throughout history, Russia has faced existential threats and emerged stronger because we were willing to take decisive action when necessary. Today, we face such a moment. After extensive consultation with our Security Council, military leadership, and economic advisors, I have authorized the implementation of emergency measures to protect our nation's digital sovereignty. Putin paused, allowing the weight of his words to sink in. Beginning at noon today, Russia will initiate a controlled disconnection from the foreign-controlled global internet. This temporary measure will be followed by the activation of our sovereign RuNet network, which has been developed over many years for precisely this contingency. This transition will ensure that critical services, domestic communications, and essential functions continue uninterrupted, while protecting us from foreign interference. As he spoke, reaction shots showed ordinary Russians watching in cafes, subway stations, and living rooms. Some faces registered shock, others confusion or concern. Let me be clear about what this means for daily life. Internal communications, phone calls within Russia, text messages, and access to Russian websites and services will continue to function normally. However, connections to foreign internet services will be temporarily unavailable as we transition to secure alternatives. Our technical experts will work to restore access to essential international services through carefully monitored gateways in the coming weeks. Putin's voice took on an edge of determination as he continued. I understand this will cause disruption. We have prepared extensively to minimize hardship. Strategic reserves have been positioned across the country to ensure food supplies, medical services, and fuel remain available. Our financial institutions have implemented contingency measures to ensure continued operation. Prices and currency values will be temporarily stabilized by government action. What happened next shook the Kremlin watchers around the world. Putin revealed information that had long been classified. For over a decade, while the world watched our military exercises and diplomatic maneuvers, we quietly built something more important: digital sovereignty. We developed our own domain name system, created data storage capacity for our entire nation's information, and established domestic alternatives to foreign services. Today, these preparations will serve their purpose. Outside Russia, intelligence agencies and foreign governments scrambled to assess the implications. Emergency meetings were called in Washington, Brussels, London, and other capitals. Financial markets opened to chaotic trading as investors tried to gauge the impact of Russia's digital secession. Inside the country, the announcement triggered a predictable wave of activity. Long lines formed at ATMs as citizens rushed to withdraw cash. Grocery stores saw shelves emptying as people stocked up on essentials. Mobile networks became congested with calls as people reached out to family and friends. In the Kremlin Situation Room, Putin and his core team monitored the unfolding events. Reports flowed in from across the country as regional authorities implemented their previously classified instructions. The FSB had increased its presence around critical infrastructure, and military units moved to heightened alert status. Mr. President, Shoigu reported, preliminary network segregation has begun. We're seeing the expected patterns of traffic as citizens attempt to access foreign services. Domestic alternatives are handling the increased load as projected. Putin nodded, and the Western response. Sergei Naryshkin, the foreign intelligence chief, consulted his tablet. As expected, emergency meetings in all NATO capitals. Their cyber commands have initiated defensive protocols, but they appear hesitant to launch counter-operations without understanding our full capabilities. The Americans have moved their strategic forces to DEFCON 3 as a precaution, but diplomatic channels confirm they're interpreting this as a defensive rather than offensive measure. In China, publicly neutral, as agreed. Their state media is reporting our announcement without commentary. Behind the scenes, they've begun their own network adjustments to maintain privileged connections with our systems while hardening against potential Western response. At exactly noon Moscow time, the most visible phase of Project Blackout began. Across Russia, connections to foreign websites and services abruptly terminated. Social media platforms, foreign news sites, and international messaging applications went dark. In their place, Russian alternatives remained operational, vKontakte instead of Facebook, Yandex instead of Google, RuTube instead of YouTube. For ordinary Russians, the change was jarring but not crippling. Years of gradual preparation had created a parallel digital ecosystem within Russia's borders. Government-sponsored apps had been pre-installed on domestically sold devices. Educational campaigns had familiarized citizens with Russian alternatives to Western services. The foundations had been laid long before this day. 3 hours after the disconnection, Putin appeared on television again, this time from a different location, a massive, previously undisclosed technical facility outside Moscow. Behind him, rows of servers and technical equipment stretched into the distance. Engineers and technicians worked at control stations, monitoring the digital transformation of a nation. Fellow citizens, I am speaking to you now from the heart of Russia's sovereign internet system. What you see behind me is one of several data centers that now form the backbone of our independent network. These facilities, built by Russian engineers using primarily Russian technology, ensure that our nation's digital life continues uninterrupted. The camera panned across the facility, showcasing the scale of the operation. The transition is proceeding as planned. Domestic services have been successfully migrated to our sovereign system. Essential functions, banking, emergency services, government operations, and transportation systems are operating normally. As promised, internal communications remain intact. You can still call your family, send messages to friends within our borders, and access the information you need. Putin walked among the server racks as he continued speaking. Some foreign powers have already labeled this action as isolation or claimed it represents a new Iron Curtain. This is false. What we have created is not isolation but insulation, protection from those who would use our dependence on their technology to harm us. In the coming days, controlled connections to the outside world will be restored through secure gateways. International communication will resume, but on our terms, through systems we control. The next 48 hours were critical. Across Russia's 11 time zones, the digital transformation rippled through society. Government offices operated on closed networks. Banks processed transactions through the domestic financial messaging system that had been developed as an alternative to SWIFT. Media outlets, limited to domestic sources, reported government statements and guidance. For the wealthiest Russians, those with technical knowledge and resources, workarounds emerged quickly. Satellite phones, previously registered foreign SIM cards, and sophisticated VPN systems allowed limited connectivity to the outside world. For the average citizen, however, the change was more absolute. Their digital world had suddenly contracted to the borders of their nation. International reaction evolved from initial shock to strategic recalculation. Western leaders condemned the move as authoritarian and harmful to the Russian people. Emergency sessions at the United Nations saw heated debates about the implications for global connectivity and international relations. Russia's representatives remained calm, insisting that the action was defensive and within their sovereign rights. On the third day, Putin addressed the nation again, this time from his office in the Kremlin. The initial crisis atmosphere had begun to stabilize. The Russian ruble, after an initial drop, had been stabilized by central bank interventions. Reports of civil disturbances were minimal, limited to small protests in university districts of major cities that were quickly dispersed. My fellow Russians, we have weathered the initial transition. Our systems are functioning as designed. Domestic internet traffic has been successfully rerouted through our sovereign infrastructure. Essential services continue uninterrupted. The predicted catastrophes that foreign commentators anticipated have not materialized. Putin's expression was confident, even triumphant. Today, I can announce that the first international connections through our secure gateways will be activated. These connections will initially prioritize essential business, scientific, and diplomatic communications. Ordinary citizens will soon have access to approved international content through filtered channels that protect against foreign cyber operations. What he didn't say, but what technical experts around the world were beginning to realize, was that Russia's digital sovereignty project went far beyond defensive measures. The new system gave the government unprecedented control over information flow. Content could be monitored, filtered, or blocked at a granular level impossible in the previous, more open internet architecture. In the weeks that followed, a new normal began to emerge in Russian digital life. Domestic services expanded rapidly to fill gaps left by foreign platforms. Russian software companies, protected from international competition and supported by government contracts, accelerated development of alternatives to Western applications. For educational institutions, the transition was particularly challenging. Universities had relied heavily on international journals, databases, and collaboration tools. The Ministry of Education established a centralized system for approved academic exchanges, but the process was slow and bureaucratic. Research that depended on international data sets struggled to continue. The financial sector underwent radical transformation. Cut off from international payment systems, Russian banks implemented the domestic alternative that had been in development for years. For ordinary citizens, the most visible change was the replacement of Visa and MasterCard with the Mir payment system. International transactions became more complicated, requiring special permission and processing through designated banks with international gateways. Media landscape changed dramatically. Without access to foreign news sources, Russian state media dominated the information space. Alternative viewpoints became scarcer, limited to a few independent outlets that carefully navigated the new restrictions. For those with technical skills and resources, underground information networks emerged. USB drives loaded with foreign news articles passed between trusted contacts, makeshift mesh networks in university districts, and encrypted communication tools that occasionally found ways around the digital barriers. 6 weeks after the initial disconnection, Putin made a carefully orchestrated international appearance via video link to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit. It was his first direct communication with multiple foreign leaders since the digital separation. Russia's experience demonstrates that technological sovereignty is both possible and necessary in today's world, he told the assembled leaders. We invite partner nations to join our secure network architecture. Together, we can create an alternative to the Western-dominated Internet, one that respects national sovereignty and cultural values. The invitation was not merely rhetorical. Behind the scenes, Russian technical teams were already working with counterparts in China, Iran, Belarus, and several Central Asian nations to establish secure interconnections between their networks. The outline of a parallel Internet, one dominated by authoritarian governments with different views on privacy, free speech, and information control, was beginning to take shape. Inside Russia, the government launched an aggressive campaign to frame the digital separation as a patriotic achievement. State media highlighted the work of Russian engineers who had built the sovereign system. Schools introduced new curriculum elements celebrating digital sovereignty. Billboard advertisements and television commercials promoted Russian alternatives to Western services with slogans like, Russian solutions for Russian people, and, digital sovereignty, national security. 3 months into the new reality, protest activity had largely subsided. A combination of factors contributed to this: effective police response to early demonstrations, technical barriers that made organizing difficult, and simply the human tendency to adapt to new circumstances. For most Russians, daily digital life had found a new equilibrium, more restricted but increasingly familiar. What few ordinary citizens realized was that the digital separation had also enabled a massive expansion of domestic surveillance. The new network architecture gave security services unprecedented visibility into communications. Advanced deep packet inspection technologies examined traffic flows. Artificial intelligence systems flagged potential dissent for human review. The technical means of control had become vastly more sophisticated than anything possible in the Soviet era. Putin was keenly aware of the historical significance of what he had done. In his private study late one evening, he dictated notes for his memoirs, comparing the digital sovereignty project to other pivotal moments in Russian history. Peter the Great opened a window to the West when Russia needed foreign technology and ideas, he recorded. Now we have closed that window selectively, retaining what serves us while protecting ourselves from harmful influence. Future historians will recognize this as the moment when Russia truly regained its full sovereignty in the modern age. Outside Russia, analysts and intelligence agencies were still struggling to understand the full implications. The immediate economic impact had been significant but not catastrophic. Russia's economy, already somewhat isolated by sanctions, had contracted further but avoided collapse. The planned dependency on China had increased, with bilateral trade reaching record levels as Russian businesses sought alternative supply chains. The geopolitical impact was only beginning to emerge. Other authoritarian regimes watched Russia's example with interest. Several had already initiated discussions about joining the alternative network architecture. Democratic governments worried about the precedent of a major power successfully withdrawing from the global internet, fragmenting what had been a unified system. 6 months after the digital separation began, Putin called for a special session of the Russian Security Council. The meeting was held in an underground facility beneath Moscow, one of several hardened command centers developed as part of Russia's strategic resilience program. The first phase has succeeded beyond our expectations, Putin told his assembled advisors. Our technical sovereignty has been demonstrated. Domestic alternatives have replaced foreign services. The predicted social unrest has not materialized at a significant scale. It is time to proceed to the next phase. Security Council Secretary Nikolai Patrushev opened a classified folder. Operation Mirror is ready for implementation. The offensive capabilities have been tested in isolated environments and perform as designed. Once deployed, they can be attributed to non-state actors if necessary. Putin nodded. The Americans and their allies believe we disconnected primarily for defensive purposes. They do not yet appreciate that a sovereign network is not merely a shield but can also be a weapon. When launched from our secure infrastructure, our digital operations will be difficult to attribute and nearly impossible to counter effectively. What happened next shook the foundations of Western security. From within Russia's sovereign network, a series of sophisticated cyber operations were launched against selected targets in NATO countries. Power grids in Eastern Europe experienced mysterious failures. Banking systems in the Baltic states reported anomalies in transaction processing. Military communications in several NATO countries suffered intermittent disruptions. These operations were calibrated carefully, significant enough to demonstrate capability but limited enough to avoid triggering Article 5 of the NATO Treaty. More importantly, they were nearly impossible to attribute definitively to the Russian government. The attacks appeared to originate from various points around the world, utilizing compromised systems and sophisticated routing techniques to mask their true source. When Western leaders accused Russia of responsibility, Moscow simply pointed to its disconnection from the global internet as evidence of its non-involvement. How could we coordinate such attacks when our networks are separated from yours? Russian diplomats asked innocently. Perhaps these incidents demonstrate vulnerabilities in your own systems rather than external aggression. Behind closed doors, Putin was pleased with the results. The digital sovereignty project had achieved multiple objectives simultaneously: protecting Russian systems from Western cyber operations, expanding government control over domestic information flow, and creating a secure platform from which to launch deniable offensive operations. 1 year after the Great Shutdown, as it had come to be known internationally, Putin addressed an expanded session of the Russian parliament. The hall was filled beyond capacity, with regional governors, religious leaders, business executives, and cultural figures joining the regular legislators. The event was broadcast live across all Russian media platforms. When Putin entered, the assembled crowd rose in a standing ovation that lasted nearly 5 minutes. He raised his hands several times to quiet them before they finally took their seats. The expression on his face was one of solemn satisfaction. 1 year ago, we took an unprecedented step to secure Russia's digital sovereignty. Many outside our borders predicted failure. Some within our country doubted the wisdom of such a decisive action. Today, we can evaluate the results with clarity. Large screens behind him displayed charts and statistics showing key economic and social indicators before and after the digital separation. Our economy has not only survived but has begun to thrive under the new conditions. Domestic technology companies have grown by an average of 47%. Russian software has replaced foreign alternatives in critical sectors. Our financial system operates independently of Western control mechanisms. Putin paused, looking out at the assembled representatives of Russian power and influence. More importantly, we have secured something precious beyond economic measures: true informational sovereignty. Our citizens now receive news and information shaped by Russian values, Russian perspectives, and Russian interests. The psychological colonization of our information space by foreign powers has been reversed. The hall erupted in applause again. Putin waited for it to subside before continuing. We do not stand alone. Today, I can announce that 5 additional nations have formally agreed to connect their networks to our sovereign Internet architecture. 3 more are in advanced technical discussions to join. What began as a Russian solution to Russian challenges is becoming an alternative model for global connectivity, one that respects national sovereignty and cultural differences. Western intelligence agencies monitoring the speech immediately recognized its significance. Russia was not merely defending its own digital space, it was actively working to fragment the global Internet along ideological lines. The unified system that had connected humanity for decades was splitting into competing networks with different rules, different values, and different controlling authorities. In Washington, London, Brussels, and other Western capitals, officials struggled to develop an effective response. Economic sanctions had already been applied so extensively to Russia that few additional measures remained available. Military options were considered too dangerous given nuclear deterrence. Cyber operations against the now isolated Russian network faced significant technical barriers. As his speech neared its conclusion, Putin's tone became reflective, almost philosophical. Throughout history, technological revolutions have reshaped political realities. The printing press ended the church's monopoly on information. Radio and television created new forms of mass politics. The early Internet seemed to promise a borderless world dominated by Western liberal values. That era is now ending. He looked directly into the camera, speaking not just to the assembled Russian elite but to the entire nation and the world beyond. What we have built is more than a technical system. It is a declaration of independence in the digital age. Future generations will recognize this moment as the beginning of a fundamental realignment, when technology began to reinforce sovereignty rather than undermine it, when nations reclaimed control of their information spaces, and when the brief digital hegemony of the West began its inevitable decline. The speech was met with thunderous applause in the hall. Across Russia, the reaction was more complex. For some, especially those old enough to remember Soviet isolation, the changes had awakened uncomfortable memories of separation from the wider world. For others, particularly the younger generation who had grown up with the global internet, the new restrictions were increasingly accepted as normal, simply how things were. Most significant was the international reaction. China, which had maintained its own form of internet control for decades but never completely disconnected from the global system, announced plans to deepen integration with Russia's sovereign network. Iran formally applied to join the alternative architecture. Turkey began exploratory technical discussions about partial integration while maintaining connections to Western systems. The fragmentation that security experts had warned about for years was accelerating, driven not by technical limitations but by political choices. The dream of a single, open internet connecting all of humanity was fading, replaced by competing networks reflecting different political systems and values. In the Kremlin, late that evening, Putin met privately with a small group of his closest advisors. The celebratory atmosphere of the public event had given way to serious strategic discussion. "The Americans have finally realized what we've achieved," reported Sergei Naryshkin. "Their latest intelligence assessment acknowledges that our digital sovereignty project has fundamentally altered the strategic balance. They're concerned primarily about our ability to conduct deniable operations from within our secure network." Putin nodded. "And they should be concerned. For decades, they exploited their control of the internet architecture. They built backdoors into hardware and software used around the world. They monitored global communications through their privileged position. That advantage has now been neutralized." Defense Minister Shoigu added, "The military implications are significant. Our command and control systems are now substantially hardened against electronic warfare. The Americans can no longer assume easy access to our networks in the event of conflict. Their doctrine relied heavily on information dominance. That assumption is now obsolete. What matters most," Putin said quietly, "is that we have created time and space to chart our own course. Without constant Western information pressure, our society can evolve according to its own internal logic rather than external influence. This was always the true objective, not merely technical independence but cultural and political sovereignty." As the meeting concluded, Putin walked alone to the window overlooking the Kremlin grounds. In the distance, the lights of Moscow stretched to the horizon. The city appeared unchanged on the surface, buildings, streets, the pattern of lights, but the invisible digital architecture that connected it had been fundamentally transformed. He reflected on the long path that had led to this moment. The humiliation of the Soviet collapse. The chaos of the 1990s when Russia had opened itself to Western influence and suffered painful dislocations. The gradual rebuilding of state power. The increasing confrontation with a Western world order that seemed determined to deny Russia its rightful place. And now this, a decisive step toward true sovereignty in the digital age. Putin knew that history would judge this decision as one of the defining moments of his long rule. Critics would call it authoritarian, a return to isolation, a new digital Iron Curtain. Supporters would see it as a bold assertion of independence, a necessary protection against foreign interference. Both would recognize its significance. What no one could yet fully predict were the long-term consequences, how the fragmentation of the global internet would reshape international politics, economic development, cultural exchange, and the future evolution of technology itself. The digital world, like the physical world before it, was entering an age of competing systems rather than universal standards. As Putin turned away from the window, he felt the weight of the historical moment. He had presided over many crises during his years in power, made countless difficult decisions, but few would have the lasting significance of the Great Shutdown. Russia had charted a new course not just for itself but potentially for much of the world. The path ahead would not be easy. Technical challenges would continue. Economic adaptations would be necessary. Social tensions would require management. But the fundamental breakthrough had been achieved. Russia had proven that a major modern state could assert digital sovereignty and survive the transition. The monopoly of the Western-dominated Internet had been broken, perhaps irreversibly. Outside Russia, debates raged about the implications. Would other nations follow? Would the Internet fragment into competing, splinternets, aligned with different geopolitical blocs? Was the era of global digital connectivity coming to an end? These questions had no simple answers, only the certainty that a threshold had been crossed. In his final thought before leaving the office that night, Putin reflected on a phrase from Russian history, one often invoked in times of great challenge and transformation: we take our own path. In the digital realm, as in so many aspects of its turbulent history, Russia had once again chosen to follow its own distinctive course, for better or worse. If you enjoyed it, please like, share, and subscribe to FictionWire Russia. This is a fictional story created purely for entertainment.